This year's alternative Christmas message comes from Lady Hortensia. Crawfish done. Double N. Hello everyone. I wasn't so much asked to give this year's alternative Christmas message to the nation, indeed to the world, as begged really. People from all over the planet sent an email pleading with me to speak out and offer some no-nonsense advice and truth to people in a world that is now officially post-truth. So, without further ado, I'm going to begin with the children. Hello, children. I'm sure that you get the feeling at this time of year that your parents are trying to hide something from you. Well, you of course are correct in that assumption. You see, children, your mother and your father have been extremely naughty. They have both been complicit in the most hideous deception. Terribly sad, but true. You mustn't blame them though, children. You see, their parents were hideously deceptive people too. If you're around the age of 5 or 6, and in some cases even a little younger, you will have all heard the bizarre and inappropriate stories surrounding this time of year. Everything from virgin births, angels, wise men, as if there was ever such a thing, shepherds, etc. And then a man at the more extreme end of the deception called Santa Claus, and flying reindeer, with names like Donner and Blitzen, and of course Rudolph, with his bright red nose, pulling a giant sledge full of presents for the entire planetary population, all delivered at incredible speed in one night. And you in your little heads, you're thinking, ooh, Mr. Bezos at Amazon is not going to like that when he finds out. You're naughty too, though, children, aren't you? You go along with the deception, knowing it's not right, because at the end of it, you will have some presents that you can sell on eBay later for money. Or better still, cash in an envelope from Granny, which you can then spend on programming and coding lessons and AI technology for your future. You see, children, what your parents don't realise is that the world is advancing so much faster than they know, and what might have worked with them as children simply doesn't cut it anymore, as you are so much smarter and technologically advanced than they were at your age. You just want your parents to cut the crap and give you some bloody cash, as you've an app to design before you're 12 and a global brand to build. So today is when the great deception must end, children, for the sake of your parents, to save them all the stress and anxiety and a small fortune in pointless present buying, plus all the environmental damage done with landfill around the planet. Now, children, what is needed before we begin is for someone in the room to be the adult. So you're all going to have to be very grown up and sit your parents down. I would suggest a hot sweet drink might be useful to have on hand, as some of them might be quite shocked at the story you're about to relay to them. Here is the story they should have told you about Christmas, Santa Claus, and the reindeer, etc., etc. It was Christmas Eve, long, long ago, around the 1980s or thereabouts. Up in the North Pole, Santa, with his little helpers, who I suspect were probably traffic gangs, were just putting the finishing touches to the last of his huge selection of presents and loading them up on his enormous sleigh before they were all locked away again for another year, probably on starvation rations, as getting access to food is quite difficult in the Arctic Circle, unless you're very fond of narwhal blubber. The reindeer were all harnessed up so they couldn't escape, and they had all had a final mince and a pie before the start of the evening's deliveries. Prancer Dancer Donna, as in kebab, and Blitzen, Dasher, Vixen, Comet and Cupid, and of course Rudolph, with his famous red nose, probably as a result of his alcohol and drug abuse over the decades, to help him forget. Children, if you knew what Rudolph had been shoving up his nose for the last few decades, it would explain so much. But we don't judge, do we? How else would they deliver all of those gifts in one night around the entire globe? Indeed, without Rudolph's special snow, I doubt Christmas would ever happen. However, we digress. Santa climbed aboard his enormous sleigh and whoosh, off it went, high up into the stratosphere, above the jet stream, travelling at incredible speed, so fast he looked like a shooting star. At that very same moment, on the other side of the world in Australia, Flight 5 Alpha November Tango Alpha from Sydney to London was taking off on its 22-hour, 25-minute flight, hoping to land its passengers safely in the UK early on Christmas morning. There was great excitement on board and everyone was in high festive spirits. For one little girl on board, the excitement was almost unbearable, as Christmas Day was in fact her birthday, and she was looking forward to double presents from everyone. Her name was Holly. Very original. And she was about to be 8 years old. Her parents had organised a little surprise for her on board, but more of that later. Santa's route this particular year had been shortened as the Russians had invaded another country, and the Israelis had once again bombed and slaughtered Palestinians, mostly women and children, indiscriminately. So those two countries were off the list this particular year. Nothing changes, does it? War and slaughter. It's a Christmas tradition. The plan was to do North America and South America first, then across to Africa from north to south, then further south to Antarctica, over to New Zealand, then Australia, on to Singapore, up to Asia, and then over to Europe, finishing in the UK, and then heading back to the Arctic Circle via Norway, with plenty of Rudolph's special snow stops en route. Flight 5 Alpha November Tango Alpha was heading out over the Northern Territories towards Vietnam and on towards Dubai. The crew were busy with the early evening meal on board, and there were many requests for alcohol as people got into the festive mood. The Christmas movie was playing, The Wizard of Oz, to keep the children amused. This would be followed by the classic black and white film White Christmas with Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye. I'm dreaming of... Oh, I do apologise. A rather large man who had just about managed to squeeze himself into seat 54A was beginning to irritate the cabin crew as he had refused the onboard evening meal and was drinking quite heavily. They were hoping he would fall asleep eventually, but they were keeping an eye on him. Little Holly's father had nipped to the back of the plane to make some final arrangements with the crew for her surprise later in the flight after the halfway Dubai stop-off. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, high up in the stratosphere, the first 4 hours had gone pretty well and North America had all been delivered. There was only one slight moment of panic when Rudolph spotted the snowy Canadian landscape and tried to make an earlier than usual attempt at a special snow stop. It took Santa all his strength on the reins of the sledge to keep it heading for the high Andes in South America, which was the usual place for such a stop, high up and away from public scrutiny. 4 hours later, and South America was completed including special snow stop, and they had crossed over to Africa and were heading gradually south towards Antarctica. Santa was beginning to feel the strain a little and was thinking he wasn't getting any younger. Not since Coca-Cola had piled on the pressure in the 1940s. He longed to retire, really. He didn't really give a shit if he never saw mince pie again for the rest of his life. After another special snow stop in Antarctica, they were soon on to New Zealand and over to Australia, all within the first 12 hours. A remarkable pace by anyone's standard. Eat your heart out, Bezos, Santa thought as they headed up towards Singapore and Asia. Flight 5 Alpha November Tango Alpha was descending for a brief stop in Dubai to offload several passengers and take on a little more fuel. The man in seat 54A had indeed drunk himself into a stupor and had fallen asleep, snoring loudly, much to the annoyance of everyone within earshot. After landing, some passengers disembarked and others boarded. People got up to stretch their legs and use the toilets as the plane was refuelled. After 2 hours, they were soon on their way again, heading over the Middle East towards Europe. As little Holly and her parents slept for a few hours, the cabin crew began to prepare Bertie's surprise, which was to be presented to her as they approached the Alps towards the end of the flight, early on Christmas morning. The plan was to make an announcement from the captain's cabin that it was her birthday and present her with a cake that had been specially made in the shape of a reindeer with a bright red nose, and for the whole plane to sing happy birthday to her. Everyone had been offered a party hat to be put on at the given signal from the crew. Everyone, that is, apart from the man in seat 54A, who was still snoring loudly. Meanwhile, Santa and his sleigh were making up for lost time and had just completed Japan and China, avoiding Russia, and going the long way around Afghanistan. Santa decided to head in a zigzag pattern for the final push of deliveries down into southern Europe and then come back over the Alps to the UK and on northward to the finish on Christmas morning. He had been rather annoyed by Rudolph attempting another unscheduled special snow stop over the Himalayas, which was beginning to irritate him immensely and had resulted in further delaying their progress and sent them slightly off course, hence the zigzagging to make up time. Flight 5 Alpha November Tango Alpha from Sydney to London was in its final 4 hours of its journey in the early hours of Christmas morning, about 5 a.m, making its way over the heel of Italy and Venice towards the Alps, when the captain's voice came over the intercom. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We will be shortly over the Alps, and in about 2 hours we'll be making our final approach to land at Heathrow. There was a small cheer from some of the passengers. Before we do, however, I have a very important announcement to make. There is a young lady on board with her parents sitting in seat 23B. Her name is Holly, and today is a very special day for Holly, as it's her 8th birthday. As one, the entire group of passengers donned their party hats and began singing happy birthday to Holly, with the exception of the large man in seat 54A, who'd finally woken up to use the rear toilet and left rather a bad smell in there that was preventing the other passengers from using it, causing a queue at the forward toilet. The cabin crew brought forward the reindeer birthday cake and presented it to Holly, who was quite overwhelmed with excitement. At the very moment above them, in the stratosphere, Santa and his sleigh were in the zig part of one of their zigzags over Europe in an attempt to make up In a last frantic dash, the time to get to the finale over Norway. Rudolph, however, had other ideas, and upon spotting the snow-covered Alps below, made a sudden dive earthward in a final desperate attempt to have a special snow stop. Santa, by now, was fairly exhausted and could not muster the strength to pull him back up on course. The sleigh and a very large quantity of presents still to be delivered began to plummet downwards. On board flight 5 Alpha November Tango Alpha to London, Holly was admiring her cake, which the cabin crew had wrapped in a special box for her, and was relishing being the centre of attention. She had changed to a window seat to see the snow-covered Alps as a treat. She was amazed by the beauty of the snow-covered mountains below as the plane passed over them. Suddenly, she gasped in amazement at what she saw above them in the sky. She couldn't quite believe her eyes. She thought she was dreaming. She hadn't really believed her parents when they told her about Santa and his reindeer. Well, not since she was 5. It just didn't make sense. But she'd gone along with the deception to please her parents. Right above and slightly ahead of them, outside the aircraft, was a large sleigh being pulled by what appeared to be a herd of reindeer. And there was a large, elderly man who appeared to be struggling to control the whole thing. The whole thing was moving dangerously close to the starboard engines. At that very moment, the second flight officer peered out of the cockpit window and exclaimed, "What the f—" The last of the sentence was drowned out by a terrible grinding, wheezing, crackling sound coming from the starboard side of the plane, as on the cockpit dashboard in front of them, alarm bells and lights started flashing. The words "Fire in Engine 3" were highlighted. Outside the plane, Santa's sleigh had jammed its arse end into Engine 3 of the aircraft and was slowly being devoured by the thousands of titanium rotor blades inside the failing engine, which caught fire. Holly screamed, which had everyone looking out of the starboard windows on the aircraft. People began to panic as they could see the fire outside. The captain pressed the button to shut down the engine and put the fire out. He began to announce that everything was under control and there was nothing to worry about. There was a small fire on Engine 3, but they still had 3 engines and could land safely with 3 engines. When there was another terrible crunching, harumphing sound as Santa and the reindeer were gradually, slowly sucked into Engine 4. Again, titanium rotor blades began splintering off, hitting the outer fuselage of the plane. Pieces of antler, hooves, and part of Santa's skull and backbone shot through the window next to the man in seat 54A. There was a deafening rush of freezing cold air as the whole plane began to decompress. Oxygen masks fell down in front of all the passengers. The man in seat 54A was sucked out, arse first, through the small window, along with several people who'd been queuing at the forward toilet. By now, Engine 4 was well and truly alight and working its way through what was left of Donna and Blitzen. Rudolph was frantically trying to get away from the aircraft. To no avail. He soon succumbed and was swallowed by the horrendous remains of Engine 4 as it slowly disintegrated, sending a shower of several hundred rotor blades through the plane's fuselage, instantly decapitating Holly and the parents, which may sound horrendous, but in retrospect turned out to be something of a mercy, really. All of the presents had been pulped into tiny plastic, metal and glass microparticles, passing through Engine 3, and fell to earth like a vast rainbow, a multicoloured cloud of debris that settled over most of the Alps, parts of France and Italy. The wing broke off slowly, and the plane began to plummet and break up, tossing passengers out, some still wearing their oxygen masks and party hats, still strapped into their seats. Children in Belgium, France and Italy who had got up early on Christmas morning and were watching the early dawn sky in eager anticipation began to report their parents that they'd witnessed a fiery meteor shower in the sky. Some went outside to take a good look. Unfortunately, some of those that did never came back indoors, as bodies and great pieces of metal began to fall on them from above, killing them instantly. The wreckage was spread over 5 different countries after it eventually settled. They were still finding bodies 9 months later. A group of children in Salzburg discovered a box in a tree, and when they opened it, it contained a strange cake in the shape of a reindeer, and to their horror, its nose was that of a real reindeer, red and blooded, with what appeared to be a smudge of special snow on it. Santa was never found. He had been utterly eviscerated and pumped into pieces so small he could not be recognised as anything really, let alone human. This whole terrible event ended Christmas forever. People all over the world could not bring themselves to even utter the word again, or begin to sing a carol without sobbing and weeping hysterically. And so it was, and shall ever be, the end of all things Christmas. Now, children, your parents by now may be a little teary-eyed or even upset, but remember, you are the adult in the room. Get them to take a good long sip of their hot sweet drink for the shock. It's just the relief they're feeling, really, that all the pretense and stress of maintaining it is finally over, and also the embarrassing realisation that you are actually more adult than they are. At last, they can relax and enjoy some time off at the end of the year without all of the childish nonsense and endless bloody shopping. The good thing is, children, is that they can now invest more time in you and your future, financing your global brand and your app designs instead of wasting their money on useless bloody toys that they buy. Who knows? You may even have a grown-up conversation with them. But be gentle with them though, children. Remember, it's all very new to them. Baby steps. Did I mention I'm 102?